Hallå, hör ni mig? Vad bra. Välkomna. A warm welcome to you. My name is Mark Isitt. I'm a journalist writing on architecture and design for Göteborgs-Posten, among others. And I'm here with James Binning and Fran Edgerley from Assemble. Assemble is a London-based collective. And when I last read about them, they were 18 people. Is that still
That's
true?
True. Yeah.
Yeah, 18 people. It varies quite a lot, right? Or that's the impression I've got from reading about you.
Yeah, it changes a little bit.
Yeah.
We started as 20. There's basically people have different relationships to the group. So there's some people who are in the office all the time, some people who work for other practices who are involved in conversations, and other people who are kind of living in other cities but working on projects with us. So it's kind of
come and go a bit more.
blurry, yeah.
Ah, okay. You started in 2010, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how come you started?
Do you want to talk about that?
What was the reason?
I guess we were all kind of at a moment in time, having recently graduated, where we'd started to work in practice for kind of formal architectural offices. But in 2009, kind of when the recession really bit in the UK, lots of the kind of projects I think that had been really exciting and we'd seen kind of developing and happening as students and joining practices with an anticipation that we'd be working on those kinds of things. Maybe there was a bit of a disconnection between our expectations and some of the opportunities were around at that time. But
what kind of a disconnection would that have been?
Well, I guess that it just felt like there were a different type of opportunity, so
Yeah.
lots of development sites and things that we were able to see around the city that suggested maybe how something more kind of temporary or informal, there was kind of a space there or an opportunity for us to maybe take a more kind of hands-on approach to practice in our spare time, so evenings and weekends initially. And out of that really a kind of an idea about an alternative way of working as an architect or in a role that's kind of related to the built environment. Kind of gradually emerged, I think, through a series of early projects.
You're very hands-on in your way of tackling the projects, aren't you?
Yep.
Yeah. That's one of the main ideas behind the collective, is my impression.
Yeah, it also, it changes depending on the different projects and what our role is and what feels appropriate. But definitely the initial way we were working was there was a self-initiated project where we were the client and establishing the brief and doing the construction and running the program and doing deconstruction and doing the whole thing. And now that's kind of mutated into different kinds of strategies and ways of occupying different modes of practice, I guess. But James is going to talk about that.
Yeah,
So
we'll
I'm
hear
not
more
gonna
about that.
I think
Welcome.
spoil it.
Well, I think we're always a bit uncertain how much people know about our practice at all, or whether you maybe have even heard of us. Today I think we're going to talk a bit about how Assemble work as a design practice and in quite an interdisciplinary way, and kind of I guess the range of ways in which that has sort of changed over the past few years. First, we'd just like to say thanks very much for having us here. We came to Stockholm yesterday, a day early, spent some time in this ice hole to kind of clear our minds to give this talk. So it's been, we've had a really good time so far, so thanks very much for the invitation. There's a quote which I really like by writer David Foster Wallace, which goes that there are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" And I guess this kind of reflects, I think, some of the way that we felt about kind of practice, having come out of school with a very clear idea of what our role as architects might be and the scope of our kind of agency as people working in the built environment. And that through the kind of early projects that we did, lots of questions sort of came up and were kind of increasingly asked in different ways about the context in which we were working as designers, and how it was important maybe to think more broadly about going to work on both the conditions in which we were operating as professionals, as well as concentrating on the design of buildings themselves. So some of the things we're working on at the moment range immensely in scale. The largest project to date in the office is a formal architectural commission that we won through a competition for Goldsmiths College in London. And that involves the architectural design of new spaces and the refurbishment of old spaces for a Grade 2 listed Victorian bathhouse. So quite a lot of technical design. It was an open competition competing against other kind of registered architects, usually with lots more experience. And one of the things that we were interested in this project is how we could be kind of responsible for the delivery of quite a complex element of the new building, the cladding. So this on the left is a sort of one-to-one test panel for some dyed kind of corrugated cement board panels that will form part of this new cladding structure. So taking a material that's very cheap, usually used as a roofing material for kind of agricultural barns and things like that, and thinking about how we could treat it very cheaply and economically in a way that wasn't really labor intensive, but that kind of gives the material a completely different quality, and assembling it kind of quite carefully to give it a different kind of tectonic kind of articulation, I suppose, in relation to this historic building. So here's a model. So that's quite a large-scale architectural project where we're working also partly as the contractor. This was a commission that we recently completed on the left for Art on the Underground, who are the kind of tube metro line operators in London who commission artists quite regularly to look at commissions for their public spaces. So this involved the development of this kind of marbled ceramic tile. There's a real kind of history and tradition of innovative use of ceramics in the underground, so we were interested in kind of building on that. But in this project, it was kind of developing both 2D and 3-dimensional tiles to kind of reclad a very sort of down at heel, boring kind of kiosk right next to the station. So a much smaller scale project, but we're again very involved in the kind of physical realization of that project and its material effects. And at a larger scale, at the moment, we're working on a project in New Orleans for a hacking school, so a kind of 21st century equivalent of the adults vocational or adult learning vocational college. So looking at courses from sort of beauty and growing and around music programs and things like that, and how to kind of interweave those with entrepreneurialism and kind of opportunities for people to kind of set up businesses. So in this respect, we're kind of both the architectural designers of the large scale idea, but also working closely with people there to develop the organization and sort of put in place the right sort of institutional structures to help that organization grow over time. So we've changed a bit since we sort of informally started in 2010. We began as a CIC, which in the UK is a kind of legal structure, which means you start as a community interest company. But over time, and as our kind of projects have become kind of much more variable and the risks have kind of become much more varied, we're kind of more formally set up now as a design practice, a building company called Assemble Builders. We have a studio space that we share with a lot of others called Sugar House. And increasingly, one of the other things we have a kind of an ongoing involvement with is a company called Gramby Workshop, which is kind of grown out of a project, an ongoing project we're working with a group of residents in Liverpool. So this Assemble Studio kind of does a lot of design projects, does some design-led research, and often is involved in the kind of design thinking required to develop organizations. Assemble Builders is essentially like a separate company that mainly does the large-scale and more formal elements of contracting and construction that we originally did in a very kind of amateurish way on early projects. So this is the construction of a timber frame for a new studio space outside our offices. Sugar House Studios, which is a workspace in South London that we share with kind of 50 or 60 people working across kind of arts or furniture making. Some of them are quite small businesses. Another architecture studio, so it just provides this kind of shared workspace, really. And Gramby Workshop, which produces industrial ceramics for the home. And in terms of the way we kind of related to each other or kind of practiced, I guess, when we first set up, it was pretty anarchic. There were lots of us, around sort of 20 30 people initially, and we kind of meet in pubs in the afternoon or in the evening or at weekends and discuss what we were going to do in our design projects, or like whether we should do another project at all, or whether we should form as a company. And it was very unclear really for the first couple of years when we worked in quite an informal way, what different people's expectations were about the formality or informality of the company. At this point, 7 years later, it's much more structured. So everybody in the practice, there's now kind of 18 people that work regularly. And we have somebody who takes care of the finances and somebody who sort of sorts out the day-to-day studio management. And everybody else kind of rotates in and out of a management group on a kind of regular cycle. So it's kind of not that all of the decision-making and management is sort of handed over to a small group who manage everyone else. It's still quite an unusual and largely non-hierarchical way of working. And the other big change is that we all went from a situation where we were working as freelancers and basically had complete agency to turn down kind of projects if we didn't kind of personally agree with them or find them interesting opportunities, maybe creatively, to a structure now where we are all kind of salaried. So where initially like a proportion of money paid in as fee for a project would have gone to assemble, and a proportion would have been paid to the people to work on that project. I guess fundamentally that was a different approach to having projects in the office that were paying for more creative and experimental work to happen. It's kind of every project had its own budget that the people working on it were responsible for kind of delivering stuff within and setting the kind of creative scope of the work. And then we all kind of would have other stuff outside, so a bit of teaching work, or you might do a bit of carpentry jobs or fine furniture making or something else that varied immensely depending on the different people's experiences. But now we have a salary structure where everyone's paid the same amount of money, and any work that we do, whether it's kind of outside Assemble, or we wouldn't sort of call it necessarily like the work of the group of Assemble, but all of that income, whether it's through teaching or anything else, comes into the company, which again, like just really changes kind of the way that we see opportunities. I think we've probably taken on some projects in the last 6 months that maybe we wouldn't have before. So I think it's interesting to reflect on like that as a sort of slight change in the dynamic of how we work. And there are a couple of, well, 3 kind of main areas, I think, which have sort of typified our work over the last 8 years and how it's changed. We started with this project, which was the Cineroleum, kind of taking an existing petrol station in Clerkenwell on a site that was awaiting kind of development. That development had stalled because of a lack of finance in around 2009, 2010, when the kind of credit crunch really started to bite. And we were able to kind of put together a completely speculative proposal, took it to the developer who owned the site and wasn't going to do anything with it for the immediate time, and said we wanted to borrow it and turn it into a cinema. And we were able to get £5,000 as a grant from an arts organisation that was backed by the government. And we put £5,000 in ourselves, so because there were loads of us, that worked out about 150 quid each. It wasn't too much. And kind of working in the evenings and weekends produced this building. So it was sort of 6 weeks working part-time to build it. We sold lots of beer, lots of popcorn, sold some tickets pretty cheap. But over the 8-week period that this building was up, it was a temporary structure, it kind of gave us a bit more money than we had to begin with to think about putting into maybe a next project. So the following year, again, it was only at this point really that we sort of formally organised ourselves as a company to receive the grant money, which paid for 80% of this project to happen. So again, it was a competition where we put forward this as an idea. That sort of award gave £40,000 to the project, and we put the rest of the money that we'd kind of got in income from the Cineroleum project into this. A similar sort of economy worked, where income sort of generated, put us in a position to think about what to do next. And that helped us really set up our first permanent studio space, which was called Sugar House Studios. It was very near where the Olympics kind of development site was happening in London. So there's quite a lot of available spaces on relatively low rents for a limited kind of period of time. And that area's changed quite a lot now. And we work in a, Sugar House Studios has kind of continued, but in a different space. But the main thing that this provides, both for us and for the other group of people that work there, is access to a shared set of resources. So access to kind of woodworking and metalworking and ceramics facilities that wouldn't be possible for anybody sort of striking out on their own. It acts by having these kinds of things kind of open and accessible to a large group of people, it makes them much more economical. And that's really informed the way we've been able to work at quite a large scale on things like those kind of mock-ups for goldsmiths and things. Yard House was a project which, similarly, like we kind of saw an opportunity. There was a site next to our studio space which basically wasn't really being used, and we took an idea to the local authority to develop a very low-cost new studio building that might suggest how lots of other vacant sites in the area could also be used for this very low-cost building system to make affordable workspace for the kinds of people that were being displaced, or the kinds of uses and activities also which were being displaced from the development happening around the Olympic Park at the time. So for £50,000 of that money came from the local authority. £50,000 again we kind of put in pretty much all the money we had in the bank at that point. But it was a very, very cheap building. This kind of a very economical timber frame with a decorative cladding kind of only on the front. So like 95% really cheap, 5% really kind of special and invested in. And again, once that's built, it pays itself back over sort of 3 or 4 years. So there's kind of an economy to that project. And I guess in the way that we'd found it to be an extremely kind of valuable and enjoyable way of working to kind of have access to these facilities that we built up over time, but also in those kind of more informal ways in which we'd allowed other people or sort of tried to bring other people in to help us realize the early projects like the Cineroleum and the Folly. We tried to conceive of kind of a more formal way of setting up a structure like that could be publicly accessible. So Black Horse Workshop was a project which, in response to the availability of some money to put into projects in the kind of outskirts of London following riots there in 2011, we developed a proposal for a kind of public library, but for tools and knowledge of making instead of kind of conventional institutional knowledge in books. So it was again like quite a cheap project. It was in an existing council warehouse basically, and initially on a sort of 2-year lease, I think it was. That project's now been there for 5 years. So our role in this was both kind of identifying the opportunity and working with the council to kind of find the site, but also in developing the organisation, so like writing the job applications, hiring the staff, and making sure they're kind of supported in an ongoing way. So we retain like I guess usually as an architect, your job would sort of finish when you hand over the keys to the building. In this case, we were part of establishing a kind of trust or a board of trustees for the project that we are kind of still involved with. So there's people that are kind of in position to sort of help the project as it kind of experiences difficulties and strains and its needs change over time. And that's a similar thing with this project in Baltic Street, which is an adventure playground in an area very close to where the Commonwealth Games took place, where all of that kind of investment in infrastructure and the enormous scale of development had led to the removal of quite a lot of the existing kind of play facilities for kids in the area. So, playgrounds that were there were kind of removed or built over as part of the Commonwealth Games developments. And so we kind of put in a proposal to use some of the funding that was available for a big public art commission to celebrate the Commonwealth Games to instead kind of acquire a lease on this piece of land and invest in the creation of an adventure playground, which could be a really kind of child-led space and provide something for this kind of local kind of group and kids who were, in our site visits, it was really clear we're kind of accessing construction sites and things to sort of play in this quite risky and adventurous way. So to just try to create a sort of a formal and safe space for that to happen. And again, similar to Black Horse, in this case, it's been really critical that we have an ongoing involvement beyond maybe what would be typical for architects working in a more conventional relationship with a client and a particular project. So Fran's going to talk a bit now about one project in a lot more detail, which is our kind of work in Liverpool, which takes on quite a few different dimensions.
Yeah. Building on the work of others. We spend a lot of time in our projects trying to think really carefully about context and about kind of energy and effort and labor that's going into different avenues in a particular place when we start to get involved. And this has been like particularly important in Gramby in Liverpool, where we've been involved with a particular community there in this specific neighbourhood in Gramby, which is in Toxteth in South Liverpool. And we've kind of worked in a number of different ways over, I think, the past 5-6 years, where we've kind of gone from acting as in the role of professional designer, providing a particular service, and in this case an architectural one, in the renovation of housing, and that's kind of evolved over that period of time into a kind of broader, much more open-ended, kind of opportunistic, and much more richly embedded practice with them. So now we're kind of co-authoring projects, not just working for them. So it started, just to give a bit of background about Gramby. It's this area, this neighbourhood of terraced housing that previously was built to as homes for the kind of dock workers in Liverpool's docks, and became the kind of centre for what I think is actually the oldest kind of black community in Europe, and then subsequently became home for kind of waves of different immigrants, and was this like incredibly multifaceted, open community that was also very friendly to other kind of marginalized groups as well. In the 60s and 70s, it was a place of real desperate poverty, and the government, rather than investing and trying to support people in these homes, kind of sought to take a policy of managed decline, and this was generally for the whole city as well, not just specifically for this area. But I guess this particular kind of, I guess, type of place, particularly in the north of England, became subject to very misguided housing policy, which is called HMRI, which the government bought up large swathes of land, or took back into ownership those which were being managed by housing associations. And in a kind of bid to raise the market value of those properties in a way to start economic growth in those areas, they basically destroyed huge swathes of communities and kind of displaced families who had been in particular neighborhoods for generations. So this is kind of what was left. And that was kind of a blight on not only on housing, but also on the kind of local economy. So Granby Street, which runs through the middle of this neighborhood, used to have like well over 100 shops from all different kind of nationalities, like really extraordinary place. And it was just totally seen as a kind of like place of no value, that needed to be kind of demolished, and then something could become new in its place. And I guess that there was a few kind of really hardy residents who still had ownership of a particular set of properties in this area, and they started to take kind of direct action on the streets to reclaim that area, and also to kind of highlight their belief in its value and kind of worth as a place to live and as a kind of place to have a community. So they started repainting the houses, they started planting in the streets. They started a new market, which was to kind of reinstate some of those economic activities which had been which was so sorely missed. And they also formed a community land trust, which is a legal structure that came out of the civil rights movement in America that enables community groups to own property and land, which isn't necessarily private or state or third sector organization, but people who have a vested interest in that particular neighborhood, just as a result of them being part of the community. So we kind of met the CLT through a piece of kind of speculative design, I guess, kind of master planning exercise that we were looking at for that area, which was trying to think about housing and kind of incremental growth and like multiple different projects happening and ways of trying to repopulate this area and help it rebuild itself without having one particular single specific fixed vision for how that should be determined. And also trying to think about ways of how to split up the risk, whereas previous developments which have been attempted by large-scale developers had all kind of fallen through because of issues with funding, how to kind of strategize to deal with that. And so through that piece of work, the Community Land Trust managed to get 10 houses, 10 properties in their ownership from the council, and they asked us to kind of work with them on the design of the refurbishment. And so there was a lot of trying to kind of index. We spent a lot of time in the residents' houses who had lived there for 20, 30 years and kind of indexed all of the different changes they'd made to the kind of fabric of their homes and the things that they particularly valued about those spaces, and then tried to kind of bring those into each of the different houses. And they're all in really different conditions, so it was trying to be really particular and sensitive to each specific property, and not to just have a kind of like bland, generic treatment of all the different structures. So like when a ceiling had fallen through, rather than reinstate it, trying to think about ways of creating opportunities to have a taller space. I mean, all of the finishes were very, very simple. The idea was that it could be done, this was going to be affordable housing, and that it should still feel very open-ended, so that people who are moving in are still able to like make their own mark without it feeling like they're kind of inhabiting someone else's vision. So yeah, they're very simple. And they had all these kind of different moments of craft that we had worked to produce as well, to give a sense of kind of richness. Because when they boarded up the houses ready for demolition, the council stripped everything of every asset out of them, so everything of worth. So any kind of layer of personality or habitation or love or history that had been there was removed and erased. So we were really interested in trying to reflect the kind of care that the residents had shown to their streets in the designs that we were doing for them and with them. So we were kind of living in one of the houses on the streets. We had the site office with the contractors down in the front room, and then one of the residents set up a cafe in the back, and she was like feeding all the workers as they were working on site, and we set up a kind of small fabrication space in the back for doing concrete casting. We developed a way of using some of the materials that were being thrown out of the houses as they were being refurbished. So bits of brick and roofing slate and bits of rubble, and recasting them in a kind of form of terrazzo to create a kind of centerpiece for the home. So these fireplaces that spoke of the kind of heritage and process that all of these houses had been through. And so people have kind of moved in and they've started to kind of edit the spaces, and it's really wonderful to see the change that is happening now in this area. Out of that work that we did, we were nominated for the Turner Prize, and we were trying to think about what would be basically that the opportunity that affords is essentially a media platform and a lot of attention. And we were trying to think about what is that any use to the work that we're doing, and if so, then in what way? So to try and use that as a conduit for investment into the neighborhood and to start regrowing some of this, the enterprise aspect of the community which was lost. So we started Gramby Workshop, working with a group of people, kind of artists and designers and people who were interested in learning crafts from the wider neighborhood, and occupied a old corner shop and started doing experiments to develop some products based on the designs that we'd done for the houses. So we developed a set of rules which felt important, both in terms of trying to think about the unique aspects that we were trying to introduce to the products that were in the original 10 houses, and also as a kind of ethos looking forward about the kind of labor conditions and productive environment we wanted to create. So everything that the workshop makes is designed through a process that invites chance and improvisation so that every outcome is different. And is experimental, has to be enjoyable and challenging to make, is resourceful, so try and reconsider kind of everyday materials. And generally, the organization would also act as a kind of social enterprise, so it creates a kind of infrastructure and a set of resources for the wider neighborhood as well to access. So this is one of the products, is the cutout tiles, a kind of collage of decals, so with a kind of set of certain rules that are applied beyond them. And then this is, we had sawdust ceramics, so this is the slip cast handles and light poles, and then they're cooked in a barbecue, and the kind of effect of the different additives that you put into the barbecue, like sawdust or straw or foil or banana skins, kind of affects the change and the kind of final patina that you get out. And those were both things which were in the original set of houses, and we've since tried to expand them into different ranges. So we have like trivets for putting hot things in, and then like a range of tiles as well that come out of that process. The Gramby rock process, which was the one reusing the stuff from the skips that I mentioned previously, we've also expanded, so now we do kind of countertops, and at one point we were also doing bookends and lampshade light bases. At that point we also were we had a kind of woodwork element making furniture, so there were offcuts from that which we started to look at to use for woodblock printing. And that also ended up being a basis of a kind of small furniture range. So this is all in 2015, and this was all basically in the run-up to trying to produce the showroom for the Tenderprise exhibition, which was this kind of mad exercise in like creating an idea of what this production business could be. And then there was kind of, we had a website and people could place orders in the future for orders to be fulfilled. But it was kind of just a kind of willfully imaginative marketing exercise for what this thing could be. That, and I mean, it was a really, it was a big learning curve, because we developed something like 100 different variants of product for a business which was incredibly in its nascent stages, and didn't, a lot of them weren't very fully resolved. So we were kind of working them out as we were going through production. And it was, quite a, I guess, an unexpected challenge in different ways that we hadn't really anticipated. But we made some beautiful things, and it wasn't. What is really great about it is that it set the kind of stage for what now has become a really sustainable business, which we decided to focus on architectural ceramics. So it's just like, rather than trying to do all different processes that we could possibly think of that were appropriate to do in that space, and with those available materials, we're now focusing much more on the kind of ceramic production. And it means we can be more serious about investing into equipment that increase capacity and kind of overlap with different product ranges and such. So what has now happened since then is that we've undertaken a series of commissions and try and use them to accumulate different machinery and different assets for the workshop to be able to increase product ranges. And so one of them was for ADO and Mini. In New York, we got this ceramic extruder, did a lot of experimentation, again, trying to think about how would you introduce chance and risk into something which is essentially designed to produce something that is, uniform and mechanized and continuous, and produced a kind of range of cladding tiles that was as a kind of early prototype for this facade. And then more recently, we undertook a Kickstarter campaign working with a RAM press and looking at different ways of working with stained clays to introduce variation and kind of types of texture and material effects within those molds. So it's kind of a hydraulic ram that has two kind of positive and negative sides of the press, and then you push air back through the top of, you place bits of colored clay into the bottom of the mold, and they push together. There's like, I think it exerts about 50 tons of pressure or something ridiculous like this. And then it pushes, you release it and push air through the top of the mold, and so you get this kind of perfect, replicable form every time, but we're trying to play with the parameters within that. So we've been developing some plates and cups, and they're currently under production. And our work in the neighborhood really continues as a kind of multitude of smaller projects. So that's kind of one part of the work, and the other is the Gramby greenhouse, which is trying to take the strategies or the activities that were so powerful for that community originally in terms of kind of creative attitudes, like direct action on the street and gardening also. Those were the two things which were really transformative. And to try and create a space that can provide a way of them kind of continuing to happen in the area and to be the kind of backbone of that community. So there's two houses that were had fallen into such disrepair because of the roof, the state of the roof when they were closed up, that they're essentially now kind of masonry shells. And so we've applied for some money to transform them into a kind of shared community green space, and also a studio flat, which will provide a kind of revenue income for this space, and also a possibility for hosting artists. There's going to be an artist residency program there, which has already started. And really, though, we're trying to use the creation of that building also as a way of trying to profile different products from the workshop. So one of the bathrooms is going to be using these kind of marble tiles, which we've been developing, and another one will be using these cyanotype tiles, again using decals and taking advantage of different temperature ranges in the kiln to give this kind of spectrum effect. And we've also been looking at local clay beds and working with a local brick factory to understand the kind of chemical composition of these clay bodies, and doing a lot of experiments with them. And they're now forming the basis of a kind of another range of products, of lights and stuff, and they're all also going to go into the winter garden. So it's trying to create kind of like these like overlapping activities between the kind of creation of these spaces and the activities that are going on between them. So when the artist residency starts to become more formalized, then they'll also be able to use the kind of resources of the kiln and the workshop space. And so there's kind of back and forth between these different projects, and the idea is to create a kind of network, and that network of kind of independently kind of like, I guess the fact that they can each independently be I'm not struggling for a word. Maybe sustained. Okay, I'll go for sustained. That then, that there becomes a kind of richness and an autonomy and a kind of dynamism that can create, reflect a more real rebuilding of this area, rather than it just being in this kind of single vision. And that it's also really open-ended, and it is changing, and that it's constantly evolving. And that feels really important, that by doing kind of smaller scale projects, that they can, really start to take on their own directions. And it's not so controlled. I guess that in a way relates to what the kind of parable that James told at the beginning about the fish and the water. And I think something that's really critical, or I think the most interesting thing about the way that we get to work with one another and the kind of ranges of projects that we're doing, is that we're not just thinking about the kind of physical material outcomes, but we're also thinking of design and architecture and work as addressing kind of the kind of culture which you provide for, and the kind of activities that you support in a space, and the way that the organizations are structured, and what kind of relationships through labor that you're creating in the way that you're setting up projects and running them. And so really the kind of working practice is just trying to be as broad as possible and as rigorous in taking kind of the same attitudes of generosity and complexity to all those different mediums. Yeah. So thanks.
Thanks
for
very much.
listening.
He's left us. I think he's coming back. That's okay.
Great. Are there expressions within the office like that is so not assemble?
I'm sure it gets used, yeah. Yeah. Although, I mean, it's quite difficult to pin down, like what is really an assemble project or something. I mean, I think like there's often a weirdness, or I think there's always an idea of like economy and trying to do things very simply. Like most of the things formally don't have a huge amount of like fuss or complexity, but there's an interest in the way that they're made and trying to make more out of the, make somebody maybe think more about the way that something is produced, or think about how you can sort of mess around a bit with the process or do something. I guess in the way that in those early projects there was a kind of an amateur spirit or a not knowing or a naivety that was really critical to the creation of the kind of feel and character of those projects. And in a way it's often now trying to begin with the process of fairly open-ended experimentation and be open to mistakes happening, and then that being a better basis to have a conversation about how to meet the specification that you need to meet, depending if it's going in a public building or something.
But that amateur spirit, I mean, that's still very apparent, I think, in the work. It's I imagine something which you find important to hold on to.
I think different people would answer that question differently. I think we're interested in definitely amateurism in as far as there's a kind of richness to that. Where
the curiosity.
Yeah, and also a kind of whimsical side to it, and the fact that often means that you can read like the role that the human being has had in the creation of something, whether that be the surface of a facade or the production of a specific piece of homeware. So I think we're interested in that way. I think the assemble question you asked previously is also in a way related to that, but kind of there's this kind of tension between the idea of what assemble is and then the fact that it is actually only just a group of people who've come together to have an opportunity to learn through doing projects together.
Yes. Is that how you see yourselves, that it's an opportunity to learn through doing projects?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, and in that sense then, if people are interested in learning certain things through the vehicle of assemble, then there's no reason why those things can't become assemble work.
No, of course.
But there's a tendency, as I think is like really prevalent in like all like business, and the idea of branding, that to kind of like give too much agency to the name of the thing. So we can be like, oh, assemble, just like, you can blame assemble for these things, when in actual reality, like, it doesn't exist other than the kind of constructive relationships we have with one another. So that's not very healthy. So I think it's a tricky thing to try and keep on bringing back your own power away from what the idea of this collective is, and that actually you're creating your actions and your cumulative kind of energy is the only thing that makes it exist at all.
Do you see yourself as a company, or do you see yourself as a project?
It's kind of, but I mean, I think on the trajectory from a very informal set of relationships at the beginning to a more formal set of relationships now, and then having been around for 7 years, we can start to think of like, that we might actually be around in another 7 years, still working together in this way. So there are certain things as, people are at different stages in life and stuff that you want certain assurances, or, the tendency is always to formalize those things more, I think. And so that's kind of currently what's happening. But I mean, I still think most of the ways that we work are relatively informal. It's trying to always put in, I think, like a minimum set of mutual responsibilities to be clear on what everyone's expectations are from others. But, and that's... But I mean, I think that what we're in the position to do, is always to change it. As Fran says, it's like, as simple as a thing, but really it's only what we make it. So we could go back to being much more chaotic and informal if we felt like some of the things we'd invented and put in place have become like too bureaucratic and not the way that we want to work. And I think, part of the way that we started out was in response to not finding the culture of working in an architecture practice particularly close to or exciting in the way that being a student of architecture was really exciting. Like the questions you were asked or the way you were expected to sort of understand your role or your agency, or just the means by which you go about solving problems were very varied. And inevitably in architecture practice, there's, those kinds of things are becoming, the range of tools are becoming much kind of more prescribed in, through kind of pieces of software and, all the, there's so much more compliance. And I think we're kind of working in a space where we're trying to come at it from the other way, which is not to start by saying...
A more analog way, or...?
Not necessarily. I just feel like, it's trying to work out the things that we do need to adopt because we can't practice the way we want to practice without them, rather than starting by doing all the things that compliance says you have to do and then trying to find space within it, because actually I don't really think there is very much. And so that's the thing with like that, that cladding panel for Goldsmiths or something, or the coloured tiles for the facade of that building. If you, we had the Goldsmiths project began with a conversation with the manufacturer about developing that as a system with them, and nobody would sign it off. And we know because we can build it, you can test it, you can see how robust it is. It's better for us to sign it off, otherwise it won't get built, or it'll get built with loads of cost.
What does that mean?
Well, like take responsibility for its construction out in the world in a public place for, and say like, we think that this is, a high quality thing, and we'll take on the risk for it, because I think a lot of it isn't really about risk. It's like those early projects were just things where kind of unknowingly often, we took on a lot of responsibility for all aspects of the project, and it's kind of, running and health and safety and getting the things built and making sure they didn't go over budget. And those are kinds of things within architecture that architects have often like given responsibility away for, like largely the responsibility for project management or post-occupancy study, like all of these things.
But do you at school? Do you learn these things? I mean, do you learn this hands-on approach when you study architecture in England?
Like there's more. I think certainly like the way that we were taught was that there are lots of different ways that you can look at a problem, and sometimes it's better to go to the workshop to try to work something out. Or I mean, I guess the thing that I particularly found like in working in practice was that often you're drawing things that feel incredibly abstract, and you don't. You're asking builders to put things together, but you don't really understand what you're asking them to do, because, like I've never, or had never like built a plasterboard wall or something, and yet you're expected to be able to draw these things which are, or like carry an authority in the way that you produce drawings and ask people to construct, which you don't necessarily have.
No.
And so it was just a different way of trying to think and work through and understand how things could get made, and. And then out of that kind of, very different approach to projects, I think, kind of relatively naturally develops a quite an unusual like visual language for the work, and that's really a reflection of the fact that often things are done in a quite a laboured or naive or but kind of there's a lot of interest in the endeavour and working through something.
That shows.
Yeah, I think it's also it's like an attitude or like a way of having attention to the world or wanting to engage with work, and which isn't really anything to do with architecture. It's just a way of working and working together, and the way of thinking about what's important and how to look at things and how to analyze things. And so it was kind of, when you ask about hands-on, where you taught that school, it's like, I think, well, there's a few of us who didn't actually study architecture at all, and so I think, and it's not really necessarily about background, it's about understanding what's possible for you to have agency in, and how, and then I guess a lot of our ideas have come from feeling like that's really empowering.
Do you think that helps you in communicating with the locals, for example, in the Liverpool project, that you're not architects stepping down to the people to talk to them, that you're a more mixed lot?
I think most of the people who went to speak with the community then at the beginning were the people who had originally studied architects. I think I think we're good at listening to people.
You must have certain tricks, though.
I think the main trick is just working really hard.
Yeah?
Yeah.
But you're incredibly successful, because if you look at your website, there are so many projects in Sweden and in the Nordic region going on of that kind of social character. You try a little experiment, but it rarely results in anything permanent or proper, But your website is just packed with realized projects of an experimental kind. So you must have you must have found a method.
Well, partly, I think lots of those projects do rely, whether it's the projects in Glasgow that we talked about, or the work in Liverpool, or an earlier project that we did in South London, which was our first kind of formal job with a client, which is a new town square in a place near kind of Croydon that didn't really have a particularly a functioning town square at the time. It was kind of used as sort of spillover car parking space and for an occasional market and things. And all of those projects relied on spending a lot of time in a place and trying to kind of understand it in as much detail as possible. More depth than would be possible if we were to go and produce our site drawings and photograph the place and look at it purely through the lens of an architect. And I guess part of that was that we were maybe young, and some people had good talkers or whatever, and made people feel comfortable in a different way to an architect turning up and being I'm consulting you, this is a formal consultation, I'm doing my bit.
Yes.
Maybe some of the things that we did felt less procedural. And I think there was also, in realizing the cinema project or the other projects, I think how dependent we'd been on asking for help in those situations. There were loads of things that we didn't know. I mean, really, when we started, people were struggling to know which way, which drill bit to put in to make a hole in a piece of wood, or how to turn a saw on. The level of skill, it wasn't that we were a bunch of incredibly hands-on, skilled people. It was all learned through, they're very crude, actually, lots of them.
Learn as you go along.
Yeah, but or work out, get far enough to have some intention or know what you're trying to do, and then find the person that can help you do it properly. And so we kind of got used to, or got comfortable with the idea of just asking somebody who clearly did know what they were doing for help. And that's different to how I felt, in architecture practice, where if I'm on site with a builder, I need to tell them, the kind of culture was much more always expected to be one where you have the answers. Of course. Even if you don't.
And when you look back at those projects where you've learned as you go along, are you Christ, I wish I knew all that I know now when we started? It would have been so much better.
No,
or
no
it would have,
but they wouldn't. They'd be, I mean, but then now there's a different scale of challenge and a different complexity of challenge, and I think it's just trying to not accept. Yeah, still. I mean, it's interesting you say that because if it's very common, obviously, for you to look back on something you did 10 years before and be like, "Oh my God, I can't believe I used to dress like that," or "I used to have that haircut," or And actually, we all look back at those projects and see in them really the thing that we, can't really afford to lose. I think in the process, I think we learned it was like going back to school again and really finding suggesting a different way of working that has been the thing that's evolved into the model of practice we are today. But I think if anything, it's the other way around. Not
other way around.
Yeah, which is I mean I hadn't thought about it in the way that you'd said that. Yeah, but yeah.
Final question: the name Assemble. Please explain.
I don't know. We had a really long. It was probably the biggest conversation we've ever had.
We've had some really long conversations.
That was a big argument at the office
in the past. Yeah, we've had.
Well, it wasn't an office at that point. It was a bedroom.
Yeah.
Sorry?
It was just someone's bedroom.
It was in someone's bedroom.
Well, we just used to meet in somebody who had like a. It was like one of these places where you basically your living room and bedroom and everything is the same space. So. Yeah, but I mean, we used to have, sometimes still do have very, very long meetings when there isn't anybody to say like, "Here's the decision. This is what we're doing." You can get a lot of different opinions, and the name was like the first one of the big decisions we had to make and stick by. So, yeah, it was probably a good. There's a short list of about 30, and then it came down to.
That's really bad.
And some were really. I mean, they were awful.
Yeah.
They were really bad.
Give an example.
I mean, what? They're too bad. Some were like kind of quite pious as well, and like if I had a hammer, we wouldn't be here today if we'd chosen some of these names. That's for sure.
You wouldn't have won the Turner Prize.
I don't know.
Well, thank you very much for coming.
Anyway, yeah. Well, thanks very much for having us. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mark.
Thank you. Och tack för att ni lyssnade.